Good evening, everyone. And tonight we're going to talk about different prophets and the way they talk about Yetziat Mitzrayim, the Exodus from Egypt, and the time spent in the wilderness, and how that is central to kind of how they see the relationship between God and the people of Israel. So what we're going to look at is mainly Hosea, Amos, Yirmiyahu, and Yechezkel, Hosea, Amos, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, right? And we're going to look and see how the Exodus appears in their prophecies. So with no further ado, I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to jump right in. Okay, and what we're going to start with, I believe, is we're going to start with Hosea. So Hosea, and I've mentioned this before, Hosea, it's actually interesting because even though Hosea has some, in a way, fairly harsh prophecies, because he's always talking about how Israel's like a cheating wife. Oh, wait, I think you see the wrong screen. Do you guys see Hosea here? Hosea chapter 2? Yes? Okay, good. Yeah. So Hosea talks a lot about the love between the people of Israel and God. And yes, I know there's a whole attitude that when we have love in the Bible, it's not regular love, it's a specific kind of relationship between vassal and Lord. At the same time, when Hosea is talking, the analogy he keeps using is man and wife, a husband and wife, right? So it really does seem to be he's talking about love, the way we would talk about love. So let's see an example. Here is where he's talking about how Israel has essentially kind of betrayed God, and what's going to happen is that they're going to kind of lose everything, right? And because they don't appreciate what God has done for them, and so they're going to lose everything. And what's going to happen then is, it says, Lachen hine anochi mefateh. This is God speaking, right? Lachen hine anochi mefateha v'olachtia hamidbar v'dibarti aliba. So I will seduce her, as it was. I will kind of draw her and bring her to the wilderness, and I will speak to her heart, right? ונתתי לה את כרמל משם ואת עמק אחור לפתח תקווה וענתה שמה כימי נעורה וכיום עלותה מארץ מצרים. And there from the wilderness I will give her vineyards. In other words, I will nourish her from there. And the valley of Achor will become the door or the entrance to hope. And she'll answer there as in the days of her youth, as on the day she came up from Egypt, right? And on that day, says God, you will call me my man. You will not call me Baali, my owner husband, which of course is also the name of an idol, of a foreign god, Baal, right? You won't call me Baali, you'll call me Ishi, right? Now, of course, and I've noted it before, that in fact, even in the Torah, in general, the standard word for husband is ish, man, the same way the standard word for wife is isha, right, woman. And we only see the use of, in general, we only see the use of Baal to mean husband in a case where there is some kind of lordship type relationship. Like, for example, when he's responsible for her oaths, that's a place where you'd see the word Baal used to delineate husband. So in this case, I'm going to take you back to the wilderness, and we're going to recreate that beautiful young love that we had when you came out of Egypt, right? And you're going to call me my man and not my Baal, right? And she won't even mention the names of all the Baal, all the different Baal gods. They won't even be remembered by name. V'charati lahem brit bayom hahu im chayat hasadeh v'im ofer shamayim v'remes ha'adama. there's going to be, so I'm going to have a covenant on that day with the animals of the field and the birds of the heavens and everything creeping on the land. There won't be any more war. No more war. They will all lie down safely. In other words, this new covenant, which is going to be instead of, and we're going to see this in other prophets as well, the idea that you're not just going back to the wilderness to renew the love, there's also a covenant involved, right? There's a new kind of covenant parallel to the one at Sinai, but better because it's never going to be broken, right? And it's going back to the basics with the animals. It's a basic, almost a going back to creation, right? Because this covenant is going to encompass the entire world. All right. Verastikli leolam, verastikli betzedek ubmishpat ubechesed uberachamim, verastikli beemunah, v'yadat et Adonai. And I will, I'll betroth you to me forever. I'll betroth you to me with justice and with law and with kindness and with mercy. And I will betroth you to me with faith more in terms of keeping faith with each other, right? In other words, there's going to be a real commitment, and you will know God, right? And all the land, the sky and the earth, they're all going to be part of this, right? And in the end, and I will say to Lo Ami, not my nation, that you are now my nation, and he will say my God, right? And here we have this recreation of this kind of imagined, just like when you came out of Egypt in your youth, and you had this time with me in the wilderness and this covenant, we're going to recreate that. We're going to take you back, get rid of all these jewels you've gotten from your lovers, start from the beginning, and we're going to go back to that. And so for Hosea, there's a lot. The exodus from Egypt really symbolizes love, the love of God for his people, and that kind of innocent young love of mutual caring and mutual commitment between God and his people. And we can see that in other places in Hosea as well. So let's go on to we'll do it relatively quickly. Well, here it's actually in different aspects. So let's take a look at, actually don't even, here we are. So here, here we see the love. And this is just, I'm just want to read this pasuk, this verse to you. I'm now in Hosea, Yud Aleph, Hosea chapter 11, first verse. Ki nar Yisrael v'ohavehu, u'mimitzrayim karati livni. Right? He says, because Israel was a child and I loved him, and from Egypt I called to my son. Right? This the coming out of Egypt showed God's love like for a child, right? And this is when Israel was a child. This is the beginning of the nation. They're young, and God took them out. And then it goes on, of course, that Israel, and particularly Ephraim, because remember that Hosea, speaking to the northern kingdom, did not keep faith with God, right? They did not hold up their part of this relationship. I'm just going to pause because I see some comments. So Danny and Libby say this idyllic image of the Exodus doesn't seem to have much to do with the way it is described in the Chumash. I actually kind of beg to differ on this one, because it's Moshe said it is in Shemot, let's on Bamidbar. Yeah, so we have the idea is that there is, particularly when they go out of Egypt, all of Israel's like, yay, we're all going out of Egypt together. We are going to worship God, right? And there's this kind of there's this kind of togetherness in following God, right? And there's there's an initial, the whole thing with the kids and the blood, and they all do it, right? Everyone does everything, and they all go out. Now we're going to see, first of all, there's a big part of this remembering the going out of Egypt. We see this a little bit less in Hosea, but still somewhat. Like Hosea is more focusing on the more recent idol worship, but there's a lot. Yechezkel, for example, gives you a whole history of the betrayals. There's a general idea that right after Egypt, Israel was already falling down on the job, like they were already not doing it. But the idea is that the initial, let's say from this way, from going out of Egypt up to Sinai, right? That's really what they're thinking about a lot of the time when they're talking about this idyllic age, right? That's when we're all, that was the birth of the nation and the nation's relationship to God. Not that the forefathers didn't exist, right? But that's the real beginning of the nation and the relationship of the whole nation to God as a nation. And they very much see it as kind of this innocent birth and God kind of like, and let's get back to that, because since then it's been downhill from there, right? It's been completely downhill from there, right? So we'll see that also in other prophets. So here I'm going to go quickly through Hosea Yud-Bet is very interesting. Hosea 12. And I want to make sure I'm not getting it mixed up with something else. Yes. So Hosea Yud-Bet is interesting because he actually gives a different twist to all sorts of stories from the Torah, or let's say several stories from the Torah. And he's just kind of show how crummy Israel is, right? So he says, so like, for example, here we all know in the Torah, Yaakov comes out and he grabs Esau's ankle, right? And Hosea, the way he says it, Babeten akav et achiv, already in the womb, right? He was trying to trip up his brother, right? Oh no! And when he came to his young strength, Sarah et Elohim, he wrestled with an angel, with a godlike being is a good way. Like you wrestled with a godlike being, or kind of almost with God. In other words, things that we read as positive in the Torah, he's reading as negative. Look at this guy. How he in the womb he was grabbing his brother's ankle, and then once he was a young man, he wrestled an angel. Whoa, what the heck, right? And it says by Yasar al Malach Vayuchal, right? He wrestled with an angel and he managed it. He prevailed. He won. Bacha Vayitchanen Lo, and it's not clear here. Is he saying that Yaakov? See, Vayuchal, you don't know who won. Vayasar al Malach Vayuchal. It sounds like Yaakov won. Someone cried and begged, right here. But the way he's remembering Yaakov's kind of a tricky guy to begin with, right? And then and then when we go to Vanochi Hashem Elokecha me'eretz Mitzrayim od oshivcha ba'olim kimei mo'edet, I, the Lord your God, from the land of Egypt, I will yet return you to tents. Now, remember, we're talking in Hosea here. So it's a dual statement. One, it's a threat. In other words, I'm going to take everything from you if you keep on messing up. On the other hand, it's this idea of we're going to go back to the wilderness where everything was okay. We're going to go back to the wilderness and start from the beginning. But it's also absolutely a threat. Yeah, you do this, I'll put you back in tents, right? I did it before, I can do it again. All right. And if I'm kind of skipping over this, we're not doing this in depth, right? And here, so I'm just going to skip ahead to the end. Another place where a story about Yaakov is being twisted a little, or not quite twisted, but presented in a negative light, or apparently. Yaakov ran away to the field of Aram, and Israel worked for a woman, and he kept sheep, right? But he guarded for a woman. Uvinavi hela Adonai et Israel miMitzrayim, uvinavi nishmar. As opposed to Yaakov, who was kind of being frivolous and doing all this stuff for a woman, God brought Israel from Egypt with a prophet, and they were watched by a prophet. Now, is this a complete parallel? No, it's kind of a little bit of a playing with words here and stuff like that, but saying that God was always doing more for Israel than Israel was doing either for themselves or for God, right? And part of that is bringing them up from Egypt, and how he brought them up from Egypt, namely with a prophet. And this part of this is the idea that prophecy is a gift from God. And if we go back to verse Yud Aleph 11, v'dibarti al nevi'im v'anochi chazon hirbeti uviyad ha'nevi'im adameh. So I spoke to prophets. I gave you lots of visions, right? I made a lot of visions accessible, And I was kind of imagined by multiple prophets. And that's another thing I did for Israel, which they did not appreciate. Excuse me. So, I'm just now we're just really picking and choosing different places where Hosea mentions God, and coming back to this idea of the love, the Egypt symbolizing the special relationship between God and Israel, and the love, right? And here it goes a little bit step further. I am the Lord your God from the land of Egypt, and there is no God that you know, and there is no one who saves but me. Right? Right? I knew you in the wilderness, in the land of drought. Right? So what's the idea here? Not just the fact that God took you out of Egypt, took you through the wilderness, shows that it's only God. There was no one else for you, right? Nothing else for you. And if we have time, we'll go to a kind of a contrasting thing in Ezekiel, which doesn't talk about Egypt, but has kind of the same basic idea without Egypt, right? Where that I am your savior, and that means I'm the only one for you, right? There's no other God but me, and certainly for you. And I think we did this. This one we did. Okay. And did we do this? Yes. And let me just quickly summarize Hosea. So the idea with Hosea is that going out of bringing Israel out of Egypt was this beautiful moment, young love, taking them out of Egypt, showing that God is the only God. He's taking care of us. We had this relationship with him, which we very quickly screwed up. And what needs to happen is we need to go back to the wilderness, right? We need to go back to the wilderness and kind of renew that relationship. All right. Now we're going to see that that's one take on what it means, and we'll see some other takes now from others. Pause if there are any questions on Hosea. Any questions on Hosea? No. Okay. So Amos, Amos has a very interesting, because he has two contrasting takes on what being brought out of Egypt means for the children of Israel. All right. So here we have, and what Amos is dealing with, and this is kind of important to note. Actually, I'm going to stop the share for a sec. What Amos is actually dealing with, and it's important to realize this, Amos is dealing with a bunch of people that think that they're on velvet, right? They are doing great. They are crushing it, right? Because they're wealthy and they're doing really well. Amos is talking at a time when the surrounding nations are too busy dealing kind of with Assyria and that gives the northern kingdom a lot of room to expand. So there's a lot of wealth, everyone's doing well, and so we're great. God loves us, we're fine, and we can oppress poor people, and we can do whatever the heck we want, because clearly, it's like what is that prosperity gospel or whatever, right? If I'm rich, clearly I'm doing something right? So like hey, we're doing well, so that means everything we're doing is right, and we can, again, we can do whatever we want to poor people, we can do whatever we want in terms of morality, and God loves us because he took us out of Egypt, right? So Amos is arguing with that idea. So that's an important piece of background information as we look at how Amos deals with the Exodus. So here we have, we're in Amos chapter 3, and here a very classic kind of explanation of why you don't have a get out of jail free card. Shim'u et hadavar hazeh asher diber Adonai alechem bnei Yisrael al kol hamishpacha asher ha'aleiti me'eretz Mitzrayim le'mor. So he said, listen, children of Israel, the whole family that I brought up out of the land of Egypt. רק אתכם ידעתי מכל משפחות האדמה, על כן אפקוד עליכם את כל עוונותיכם. Correct. Only you from all the families of the earth did I know. Like only you did I bring out in this way, right? That's why I am going to hold you to account for all your sins. So no, you thought that we have a great relationship, and so I'm going to forgive you for everything. No. We have a relationship, so I'm watching you. I'm watching you, and I'm going to hold you to account for all your sins. Now let's see a completely contradictory verse in Amos. Okay, Amos, it's I always like to say it. I usually it's when I'm talking about Second Temple literature, but ancient works are contextual. They address problems in a contextual way. They're not meant to be these philosophical works that are completely consistent across the board. They're dealing with specific problems in different places. So here, and let me find the right place that I wanted to bring. Here we are. Amos text. So this is Amos chapter 9, the last chapter of Amos. And we're going to look at Zion verse 7. It says, Hello kivnei chushim atem li bnei Yisrael, nu'um Adonai, hello et Yisrael, haleti meretz Mitzrayim, uflishtim mikavtor v'aram mikir. So what is he saying here? He's saying the exact opposite. He's like, yeah, I brought you out of Egypt, but that doesn't make you special. He's like, you are like Nubians. Now, I want to say, I really don't think this is racist here. I'm not saying that there's nothing racist ever, but here I really don't think it's racist. I think the idea is you're like this people that's really far away, right? The Nubians are very far. They're not generally interacting with Nubians. Nubians are south of Egypt. And so you're like this really far away nation. You're like that to me. That's how much I care. Yeah, I brought you out of Egypt, and I brought the Plishtim out of Kaftor, and I brought Aram out of Kir. Big deal. You're nothing special, right? What's the point of saying this? Okay. Hine ene Adonai Elohim b'mamlacha hachata'a v'hishmadeti ota me'al pnei ha'adama. Efes kilo hashmed ashmid et Beit Yaakov nu'um Adonai. So here we have again a reversal. So he says, what's the point of saying that? He says, the eyes of God are on a sinning kingdom, and God's going to destroy that kingdom from the earth. And I really do think people are supposed to be like listening to this, right? They're like, oh no, so what you're saying is we're all going to be destroyed. It's like, no, wait. But God's not going to destroy the house of Yaakov, okay? But there's going to be a sifting, right? The sinners are going to die. So he starts out saying you guys are like all these other nations, and a sinning nation gets destroyed. But no, you are special. You're not going to get completely destroyed, but the sinners are going to get destroyed, right? All the sinners of my nation are going to die by the sword, right? So the idea is that you are special, you aren't special, but you are special, right? So why is he bringing up Egypt here? Because everyone's like, hey, we got brought out of Egypt. Both these chapters, both in Amos Gimel, chapter 3, and Amos Tet, chapter 9, it's really talking about the same idea. He's arguing with the same idea, which is getting out of Egypt made us special. God took us out of Egypt. He loves us. We're set. So the first argument is, no, you're not. It means that God's watching you all the time. And if you sin, he's going to punish you. He's for sure. And the second, he's like, no, you're not so special. God took other nations out of places and brought them to other places. Big deal, right? But yeah, you are kind of special in that you're not going to get completely destroyed. Just the sinners, right? And now I want to talk a little bit about a different aspect of what Amos says. And we're going to see this, of course, also famously in Yirmiyahu, is the whole idea of sacrifices, right? And that you didn't bring sacrifices in the desert. So with Amos, there isn't the same kind of link of Exodus plus wilderness that Hosea has. Amos is like, is dealing with the Exodus. Does the Exodus make Israel special or not? And then when he talks about the wilderness, right, he's talking about here we have Amos Hey, Chaf Hey. So that's Amos 5:25. And he's saying, Hazvachim umincha higash li bamidbar 40 shana Beit Yisrael. He said, did you bring me sacrifices in the wilderness for 40 years, house of Israel? And what he's saying is, he's like, you guys are doing horrible things, and then you bring sacrifices. I don't want these sacrifices, right? And he's like, look at the wilderness when I was, God was really close to Israel. Did you bring sacrifices then? Now, of course, if you're familiar at all with our books of the Torah, sure, they brought sacrifices, right? But you're supposed to be saying, no, they didn't bring sacrifices, right? So that's always a question. And we're going to talk about it with Yirmiyahu also. But the idea is that there is this kind of ideal still of the wilderness, right? Of being like, if you didn't bring sacrifices in the wilderness, how could you think they're the central thing, right? They can't be, because you didn't bring sacrifice in the wilderness. Now, the fact that in our Torah, it says they did bring sacrifices in the wilderness. So that's a different issue. And we're going to talk about it a little bit with Yirmiyahu. Actually, let's jump into Yirmiyahu now. I'm going to pause. So what we see with Amos is he's dealing with the Exodus, the issues of, does the Exodus mean that the children of Israel are set and can sin, which obviously no, right? And then the issue of the wilderness being kind of this thing that you aspire to in a way, or at least something you compare yourself to, and showing that sacrifices just aren't that important. That's not what God really wants, okay? Or that's not the central thing that God wants. Okay, now,
can I just interject something there?
Oh yeah, sure, go for it.
I know it's a minority opinion, but according to Ibn Ezra, and I don't think this is even where he says it, but according to Ibn Ezra, korbanot were actually not brought throughout the 40 years in the desert, only at the very beginning.
I mean, that's cool. I'd love to, I'd love to see the Ibn Ezra, because you have that whole thing of basar ta'ava, right? If you want to eat meat, you have to bring a shlamim in the desert, right? And that's in Vayikra, and then Dvarim actually, that's in so that's in Vayikra, and then Devarim kind of responds to it. So there is this idea that you're actually supposed to be bringing a sacrifice every single time you eat meat. So I don't know how Ibn Ezra, I mean, I'm sure Ibn Ezra has an explanation. Like, I'm sure Ibn Ezra explains it, but you need an explanation for that. So here we have, let's dive into Yirmiyahu Zion, Jeremiah 7. And this is where Yirmiyahu says something similar. So if we go ahead to verse 22, Pasuk Chaf Bet, right? Or actually, let's start from Chaf Aleph. We recently had this as a Haftorah, so it will sound familiar to you. All right. Ko amar Adonai Tzvaot Elohei Yisrael olotechem svu al zivchechem v'chlu basar. So this is what God says. Take olot, right? The olot are completely burned. You can't eat them at all, right? So he says, take your olot, add them to your zvachim, your regular sacrifices like shlamim, where you're only sacrificing the parts you can't eat anyway, right? And eat meat. I don't even care. Take those things that you were gonna just burn up completely, put them together with your sacrifices that you eat, and eat meat. It doesn't matter to me. Because I did not speak with your forefathers, and I did not command them on the day I took them out of Egypt about matters of sacrifices. Right? Because what did I command you? I commanded you, listen to me, and I will be your God, and you will be my people, and you should go in the way that I command you, so that things will be good for you. Right? And then it says, of course, and then they didn't listen, right? Limin hayom asher yatzu avotechem me'eretz Mitzrayim ad hayom hazeh, right? And from the day that you left, your forefathers left the land of Egypt until today, you haven't been listening. You've been going bishrirut libam hara, in the kind of evil stubbornness of their hearts, right? So for Yirmiyahu, what's the issue? And we're going to see this a lot in Yirmiyahu. What Yirmiyahu talks about is the day I took you out of Egypt as being the day of a covenant, right? That's how he looks at it. In other words, he'll say, on the day that I took you out of Egypt, we made this covenant. So he kind of compresses this idea of leaving Egypt and Sinai, right? The covenant of Horeb, whatever you want to call it, right? He kind of collapses that into this is what leaving Egypt was about. The Exodus was about the covenant, right? And about what I wanted from you. So it's becoming my people, I become your God, and the covenant, that is all compressed on the day I took you out of Egypt, right? And here the argument is, and the day I took you out of Egypt, sacrifices were not the issue, right? Now, the thing is, like, we actually read it, right, as the Haftarah for in Vayikra when we're being commanded about sacrifices, right? So you have to deal with it. But the point is, but I think it's pretty clear that the point with Yirmiyahu says, remember that he's compressing going out of Egypt and Sinai, right? So the point is that at Sinai, that wasn't the commandment, right? That wasn't the point, wasn't sacrifices. The point was, I'm the Lord your God, do these things. And so that the main point of serving God wasn't these sacrifices. And I think that the Haftarah, we learn the Haftarah for the parsha where we learn about sacrifices to remind us, yes, we're reading about sacrifices. We're going to be hearing about sacrifices for weeks, right? But that's not the main thing. The main thing is to do what God wants, right? So that's Yirmiyahu. Now let's dive into some other pieces of Yirmiyahu where he sees again, where we're going to see this collapsing and connection of the covenant with leaving Egypt, right? And you can absolutely understand this isn't like, I don't think this is like, some kind of incorrect shorthand. I think this is the whole thing of leaving Egypt made us God's nation, right? And part of being God's nation is the covenant. And that's why the whole thing, leaving Egypt is so tied to getting the covenant. So if we look at Yirmiyahu, let's look at, where are we here? Yes. So let's look at Yirmiyahu Yud Aleph, Jeremiah 11. We're going to skip to Pasuk Vav, verse 6. Yes. Vayomer Adonai Eli kra et kol advarim ha'ele barei Yehuda u'v'chotzot Yerushalayim lemor shim'u et divrei habrit hazot v'asitem otam. So God says, call out in the cities of Yehuda and in the open spaces of Yerushalayim, saying, listen to the words of this covenant and do it. Ki ha'ed ha'idoti b'avotechem b'yom ha'aloti otam me'eretz Mitzrayim b'ad hayom hazeh hashkem ba'ed lemor shimu v'koli. Because I kind of testify, I told your forefathers on the day I took them out of Egypt until today, over and over again, I said, listen to me, listen to my voice. They didn't listen, they didn't incline their ears, and each one went in the stubbornness of his evil heart. Right? And I brought upon them all the words of the covenant that I commanded them to do, and they didn't do them. And that also is a big part of how Yirmiyahu, and we'll see Ezekiel also, think about the Exodus, because it's not just that the Exodus is the time of the covenant, it's the beginning, it's all downhill from there, right? As soon as we get out of Egypt, we're not listening anymore. You never listened. So it's not quite the same thing of, let's go back to the wilderness. The wilderness was perfect. No, from the day I took you out of Egypt, I sent you prophets and you didn't listen. You didn't listen. You didn't listen. You didn't listen. We need a different covenant, right? We need a covenant that you're going to keep. Okay. So that's why both Yirmiyahu and Ezekiel look forward to a future where the nature of Israel is going to be changed so that they keep the covenant. Right, and that's the future that they want to bring. Not Hosea's future where they go back to the wilderness, right? Even though there is going to be that aspect also, but they have to go through a major change in nature in order to not break the next covenant. Okay. So where are we here? Yeah, Yirmiyahu Lamed. Let me just do a quick. Okay. So here again, this I'm just going to do a very quick reference here. It's talking about, because what happened was under Yirmiyahu, so everyone freed their their Jewish indentured servants after 6 years, like they freed them and then they took them back, right? So God says to Yirmiyahu, Ko amar Adonai Elohei Yisrael, Anochi karati brit et avotechem biyom hotziot me'eretz Mitzrayim mibeit avadim lemor miked sheva shanim techalchu ish et achiva ivri asher yimacher lecha. So God is saying, I made a covenant with your forefathers on the day I took them out of Egypt. Remember when I said it's all with Yirmiyahu, it's all compressed. The whole covenant is the day I took you out of Egypt. So on that day, when you were being released from slavery, I told you you should never have an indentured servant, a slave from your people for more than 6 years, and you are breaking that. Okay. So now let's go to what we have here. This is reach. Yes. Okay. I want to just make sure. What is this one? Yeah, we read that before, right? Did we already did? Yeah, we started with this. So let's go to Yirmiyahu Lamed Aleph, and then we're going to go to Yechezkel. We still have time. So Yirmiyahu Lamed Aleph, Jeremiah 31, is again showing us that this is going to take us now from what was to what will be. If we looked at here, Pasuk, it should be Pasuk Lamed, so that's verse 30. Hine yamim ba'im, Nu'um Adonai, v'charati et Beit Yisrael v'et Beit Yehuda, Brit Chadasha. The days are coming, says God, and I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. Okay. Lo chabrit asher karati et avotam biyom hechaziki biyadam lo tziyah me'eretz Mitzrayim. Not the covenant that I made with your fathers when I took them by the hand to take them out of the land of Egypt. Asher hema heferu et briti v'anochi ba'alti bam nu'um Adonai. They broke my covenant, and I was their Lord, says God. Right? Kizot habrit asher achrot et Beit Yisrael achrei hayamim hahem. Nu'um Adonai natati torati b'kirbam v'alibam echtevena vayiti lahem lelohim v'hema yuli la'am. Because this is the covenant that I'm going to make with the house of Israel after these days, in other words, in the future time. And I'm going to put my teaching, my Torah inside them. I'm going to write it on their hearts. Right? They have to go through an internal change. And Yechezkel, of course, also has this internal change that they must go through so it doesn't happen again. So this covenant they stick to, right? And then I'm going to be their God, and they will be my nation. Okay. V'lo yilamdu od ish et re'ehu v'ish et achiv lemordu et Adonai ki chulam yed'u oti lemiktanam v'agdolam ne'um Adonai ki eslach lavonam u'lechatatam lo eskar od. They're not going to have to teach each other, saying, go and know God, because they're already going to know God from the little to the big one. This is also kind of this internal change. It's not just going to be an external covenant, because that didn't work. That was the Egypt covenant. They never kept it. So this new covenant is going to be etched inside them. It's going to be internal as well, right? And we're going to see that a similar thing with Yechezkel, where it looks like a lot of my Yechezkel things disappeared, but with Yechezkel, the change is actually a change in heart, right? I'm going to remove their heart of stone and give them a heart of flesh. Again, an internal change so that the new covenant sticks, right? So as opposed to Hosea again, and even Amos is just talking about it being special, and Hosea talks about leaving Egypt as this beautiful young relationship. For both Yirmiyahu and Yechezkel, it was this one moment where God's like, I did this wonderful thing for you, now be my people, and we never, ever listened. And because we never, ever listened, that means that the new covenant is going to require an internal change. So let's take a look at Yechezkel. This is Yechezkel Chaf. Yechezkel, actually, we're going to pretty much concentrate on this chapter. If we have time, we're going to look at a contrasting one where he doesn't talk about Egypt. He's here. Let's start from here. So he tells Yechezkel, "V'amarta lehem." This is what you should say to them. So says God, B'yom b'chari b'Yisrael ve'esayadi l'zera beit Yaakov ve'ivada lehem be'eretz Mitzrayim ve'esayadi lehem le'emor ani Hashem Elokechem. On the day that I chose Israel, I lifted up my hand to the seed of the house of Yaakov, and I was made known to them in the land of Egypt, and I lifted up my hand to them, saying, I am the Lord your God. Right? On that day, I raised my hand to them to take them out of the land of Egypt. El Eretz Asher Tarti Lehem, it's a land that I toured for them. Zavad Chalav Udvash, flowing with milk and honey. Tzvihi L'chol Artzot, a beauty, like a beautiful land for all among all the lands. And so, what was the thing that I asked for? Ishi could say Enav Hashlichu Mitzrayim Al Titamu. Get rid of the idols, right? Don't get rid of the idols and don't be impurified by the idols of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Vayomruvi, they rebelled against me. They didn't want to listen to me, right? And what did they do? They continued to worship idols. Okay. In other words, they were still in Egypt, and I wanted to punish them, but I didn't. But I did it for my name. In other words, they were bad from the get-go. They were bad from the beginning. And even though already in Egypt they weren't listening to me, I still was going to take them out for my own kind of reputation, right? And so he took them out of Egypt, and he takes them out of Egypt. And I gave them my laws and my ordinances. I made known to them that the things that a person should do and live through them. Right, it's an echo of Dvarim of Deuteronomy. I gave them my Shabbatot, right, my Sabbaths, to be a sign. And Vayamru Beit Yisrael Bamidbar, and in the wilderness they rebelled against me. In other words, Ezekiel, like Yirmiyahu, sees the exodus from Egypt as just like the begin, like they just from the beginning. Except Ezekiel starts it earlier. Already in Egypt, they're rebelling. They're rebelling even before the exodus, right? And then it continues, of course, in the wilderness. And and why did God not destroy them? Because for His name, right? He brings them to the land flowing with milk and honey. I'm going forward, right? And they never keep His laws. They don't keep the laws. They desecrate the Shabbatot, right? And it just continues on. All right. V'gam ani nasati et yadi lehem b'midbar lafitzotam b'goyim uzarototam baratzot. And I also lifted up my hand against them in the wilderness to spread them out among the nations, right? Yan mishpatai lo asu v'chukotai ma'asu v'shabtotai chilelu v'achrei giulei avotam hayu enehem. Why? Because they didn't keep my laws, they didn't keep my ordinances, they desecrated my Shabbatot, my Sabbaths, and they went after the disgustingness of their forefathers. In other words, they were idol worshippers. Okay. Part of the punishment is very weird here. V'gam ani natati lahem chukim lo tovim mishpatim lo yichyu behem v'tamei otam b'matnotam ba'avir kol petarachem l'man hashimim. So what's going on here is, and I gave them bad laws, and I polluted them with their own gifts when they set apart, or when they pass through their eldest, the opening of the wombs, right? What's going on here? I've mentioned this under Yirmiyahu. There seems to indicate, again, this idea that the Judeans or Israelites who passed their children through fire for Molech thought that's what God wanted. In other words, somehow they thought that God wanted them to sacrifice their eldest kids, and that is possibly what Ezekiel is referring to here. Because I gave them bad laws, and it's paired with, and I purified them through their gifts when they made pass all their kol petarachem, any opener of the womb, any eldest, right? But again, so he says, but God brings them to the land of Israel, and even there, of course, they worship idols, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So they were from the beginning. They were sinners. So let's go. So what's the solution? What's going to happen? So here, let's skip to verse 33. Pasuk lamed gimel. Chai ani noam Adonai Elohim im lo biyad chazaka uvizroa netuya uvechema shfucha em lo chalechem. Says, by my life, says God, if it's not with a strong hand and outstretched arm, and yes, that is supposed to be parallel to taking Israel out of Egypt, with a strong hand and outstretched arm, and with anger, poured out anger, I will rule over you. V'hotzeti etchem min ha'amim, v'kibatzti etchem min ha'arasot asher nefotzetem bam. This is after the exile. I'm going to take you out of the nations. I'm going to gather you from the lands that you were spread out among. Biyad chazaka uvizroa netuya uvechema shfucha. And again, with a strong hand and outstretched arm, and with poured out anger. Okay, God will be angry, but He's going to take you out of these lands the same way He took you out of Egypt. And what's the wilderness now? Veveti etchem el midbar ha'amim. And I will bring you to the wilderness of the nations. V'nishpati itchem sham panim al panim. And I will judge you. I will enter into judgment with you there, face to face. Okay. Kasher nishpati it avotechem b'midbar eretz Mitzrayim. The same way I went into judgment with your forefathers, and probably it's talking about the Meraglim, the spies, the sin of the spies, which was in the where they all had to be in the desert 40 years and they died out, or other ones, right? Because there are plenty of places where they rebelled. But I'm going to judge you in the wilderness, just as I judged you in the wilderness of the land of Egypt. Ken ishafet itchem. Right? That's so I'm going to go into judgment with you in the future. I'm going to bring you out from the exiles and take you to the wilderness of nations, where I'm going to judge you the same way I judged you. And I'm going to take you and pass you each under the rod to see who's good and who's not, essentially. And I will bring you into the covenant. I'm going to bring you into a covenant. We're recreating leaving Egypt, but in terms of coming back from this exile, you're spread out. You were back from the get-go. Now that's it. You're exiled. I'll bring you out with using the same language as coming out of Egypt. I'm going to bring you out of these lands. I'm going to take you to the wilderness. But in the wilderness is not some beautiful place of love. In the wilderness, that's where you get punished. That's where you get judged, right? And then that's where we're going to divide between the good and the bad, right? And then I'm going to bring you into the covenant. Uvaroti mikem hamordim va'poshim bi me'eretz megureihem otziotam be'admat Yisrael lo yavo v'yidatem ki ani Adonai. And I'm going to sift, right, the those who rebel and sin against me. And from them, I'm taking them out of where they live, but they're not going to come into the land of Israel. Again, this is parallel to this idea of the sinners dying in the desert, in the wilderness on the way to the land of Israel, right? The people who follow the spies, they have to die out, right? So I'm going to sift good from bad, and the bad, they're gonna lose their homes because I took them out of the lands where they were living, but they're not going to come to the land of Israel, right? And from then I'm going to bring you to the land of Israel. I'm skipping over a verse. I'm going to mem. Sham yavduni kol beit Yisrael kulo ba'aretz sham eretzem v'sham edrosh trumotechem v'etreshit masotechem v'kol kodshechem. Right, and then you're going to come to my mountain of holiness. Cheskel likes sacrifices, right? Once you've been through this, right? Once you've been through this, and you have you've been sorted, you've gone through the wilderness of nations, you've gone through the punishment, and now you've entered into the covenant. Now you can come to my holy mountain and you'll give sacrifices that I want, right? I'm not bringing, we're not going to go into here because we don't have time. The place where Ezekiel talks about the heart, we'll talk about it in a later class, the switching heart. I'll remove the heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. But this is the same idea of you have to go through stuff to get the covenant, right? Because the last covenant didn't take, right? You just weren't good. Now with Ezekiel, it starts way before the covenant. Ezekiel, even before they're brought out of Egypt, they're already not good. And they've never been good. And now to do it, God's going to do it with force. He's like, I'm going to do it not just with an outstretched arm, but with anger. I'm going to do it with anger. And I'm going to punish the people who need to be punished, take you through the wilderness, which is going to be a purifying experience in the harshest way. And then you're going to be able to go into a covenant. Now, again, elsewhere, he talks more about doing an internal change within the people, but what we saw with Yirmiyahu is, I'm going to write things on your heart. You're going to go through this internal change. The idea of the Exodus being synonymous with entering into a covenant. With Ezekiel, the Exodus is not synonymous with entering into a covenant. The Exodus is something God did for us despite us being sinners. We have always sinned, right? God brought us into a covenant, but we've always sinned. And the solution is to recreate the Exodus, but with an extra little dollop of anger, and making and as elsewhere in Ezekiel, making that change, punishing the bad guys, so that the next covenant is going to take, right? Just as a contrast in terms of with Ezekiel, where he doesn't use the Exodus, but we see another kind of approach to the birth of Israel, as it were. So this is Ezekiel Tet Zion, Ezekiel 16, right? And this is I'm going to do it quickly because we're already a little over time, but it's talking about where it's giving a different account, just to give us a taste of it. They didn't all have to talk about the Exodus, but they do all talk about the Exodus. I want to emphasize this. We take it for granted, but the idea that the birth of the nation is Yetziat Mitzrayim, is the Exodus from Egypt, is something that we just saw kind of across the board, right? We saw it in Hosea, we saw it in Amos, we saw it in Yirmiyahu, we saw it in Ezekiel. The fact that Amos is arguing with the idea that this made us super special shows that in the northern kingdom, as well as in Yehuda, this is an idea of where is our relationship with God born? Yes, we had it from our forefathers, but it was really born in the Exodus, in coming out of Egypt. That's when we became God's people, right? So you can use that either as an example of our specialness, an example of our not specialness, an example of us not being grateful, us being bad, or us getting a covenant, right? But this is super central. It could have been, they didn't have to talk about Egypt as the birthplace of the nation. If we look here, this chapter of Ezekiel is striking in that he gives a different account of a different, not historical account, but idea, like a different kind of, from the point of view of the idea of Israel, a different account. He says, where are you from? V'amarta kol amar Adonai Elohim liYerushalayim, mechorotayich umoldotayich me'eretz HaKnani, avicha Emori v'imech Hittite. Where you're from? You're from Canaan. Your father was an Amori and your mother was a Hittite. Okay, you're not special. It's also part of it is that you're not special. It's part of the idea. You're from here. You're from here. You're just a mix of different peoples. Big deal, right? And what is this account? And we're going to go into this in a later class in depth because it's such a great chapter. But this idea is, you just had no one. You were there, you were abandoned, no one was taking care of you. God watched and made sure you grew up safely. He didn't adopt you. He watched and made sure you grew up safely, but he didn't adopt you. No one adopted you. No one wanted you. When you came to young womanhood, God, as it were, married you. And I've mentioned this before. Why does it have to be not an adoption, but a marriage? Because it has to be a covenant. It has to be something that both of parties are entering into a mutual agreement. Whereas if you adopt a child, you can't make demands of the 3-year-old, or I throw you out of the street. It doesn't work that way. But if you enter a marriage, both parties owe each other something, right? And so God watches over and makes sure the young woman Israel grows up young, but he waits till she comes to maturity, and then he marries her. He gives her everything, right? And then there's this covenant and the relationship. Okay, so this is interesting just because this doesn't use the imagery of Egypt or leaving Egypt. On the contrary, it talks about Israel as something that's being born in Canaan. You're just another nation, but you had no one wanted you, you had nothing, and God took you and he made you something, right? God took you in and he gave you everything, right? So that's a different type of account of where the relationship between Israel and God comes from. And yet we see across the board that the central idea in Yechezkel and in everywhere else is still the Exodus. Why are we God's people? Why is he our God? Because God took us out of Egypt. Because God took us out of Egypt and gave us his covenant. We entered into a covenant with him. That's where it started. And that was, like, you're going with Hosea, that was our young love, right? That was our honeymoon. Our honeymoon was between the Exodus and getting the covenant, and that's where it all started. So what we saw is that across the board, the Exodus is seen as the time when the relationship between God and Israel is born, right? And that's the time where, whether it's the young love, the Exodus is the Exodus is and the Exodus up till the covenant is kind of the honeymoon period, and it's the young love that we want to get back to, or whether the idea is that the Exodus symbolizes the special relationship between God and his people, or the idea that or just the Exodus, meaning that's when we entered into the agreement that made God our God and us his people. So that that central idea you can see across, and again you can see it both in the northern kingdom that Amos and Hosea are talking to, and in Judea much later where the Yirmiyahu and Yechezkel, and we see how central that idea is. And the contrast with that chapter that we just read in Yechezkel shows that you didn't have to use that as a central idea, but it is the central idea. It is across the board the central idea of this is why we're God's nation. It happened because of the Exodus and the covenant. So I hope you like that overview. Are there any questions?
Miriam?
Yes, I am here. Can you hear me now?
I'm just sort of wondering why you avoided perhaps the most famous of the prophecies that relates to the innocence of the Exodus, which is Yirmiyahu's Zacharti la chesed neurayich avat lechteich achrei b'midbar be'eretz Yosua.
Yeah, I mean you're right. I should have talked about that. I guess because I was thinking of it more. You're right. I absolutely should have talked about it, especially the wilderness, especially with the wilderness part of it, because what you have there is very close to what you have in that piece of Yirmiyahu is something very close to the idea in Hosea of going the wilderness as a honeymoon, right? The wilderness as showing the mutual love, right? It's and being reciprocal, and so you're right, I should have, and being reciprocal in the wilderness. In other words, when Yirmiyahu says, I remember, the kindness of your youth that you went after me in the desert. It's very parallel to what Hosea says in terms of we're going to go back to the desert, kind of to our young love. And the idea seems to be that that's when Israel was okay, right? That's when Israel was being loving to God, was being faithful and being loving. So yes, that is absolutely correct. In that case with Yirmiyahu, even though, and what's interesting is, see, when Yirmiyahu talks about the Exodus, it's almost always like the day I took you out is when you got these laws, right? But when he's talking about the wilderness, he's talking about love, right? The kind of, or kind of the emotional relationship, right? So yes, I should have brought that. Thank you for bringing it up. Any other points? Okay, so thank you for joining me, and I will see everyone who can make it next Sunday.